So we're back. Last week, we took an up and close look at a specific type of ethical theory. We took a close look at consequentialism and its most important subtype, utilitarianism. This week, you have read and analyzed an article by Peter Singer, which applies utilitarian thinking to moral obligations surrounding giving to others in dire need. We tend to think of such acts of giving as charitable, and we tend to understand charity as something good to do, but not morally required. Singer offers us several arguments for the conclusion that giving to others in dire need is a moral obligation we all have. Singer's main argument, what he calls the basic argument, relies on an explicitly utilitarian principle that we will discuss at the appropriate time. Singer has us consider a scenario which has the following features. This is how he starts the article. A young toddler is drowning in a pond in the park. You are the only one who is in a position to save the child. Helping the child will ruin your shoes, get your suit wet, and make you late for work. Finally, you are not responsible for putting the child in danger in the first place. Singer reports, and I can confirm through my own experiences teaching and talking through this reading, that pretty much every student so Singer reports that pretty much every student he has run this scenario by agrees that one ought to rescue the child. And yeah, I can confirm the same. By ought, I mean is morally obligated to rescue the child. If one fails to rescue the child, one is rightly subject to the moral criticisms of being selfish and cruelly indifferent. Whether or not one thinks failing to rescue the child warrants any kind of legal intervention, it is undeniable that those who become aware of one's decision to let the child drown are quite warranted in criticizing the person's actions, both publicly and privately, and in distancing themselves from anybody who acts like this. Singer has selected the details of this child in the pond scenario quite carefully. If you acknowledge, and most people do, that one is doing something wrong if one fails to intervene and save the child's life, then you are acknowledging moral obligations to help others who are in dire need at some cost to yourself, even when you haven't put those people in danger yourself. Hence, you have embraced a more robust ethic than an ethic which merely forbids the intentional harming of others. After setting up this initial scenario, Singer then transitions into a discussion of some details surrounding world poverty. In response to question 1b, nearly 10 million children die each year from poverty-related causes. This means 27,000 kids a day are dying. Some die from starvation, but many more die from various diseases such as measles and malaria, which do not plague first world nations, or from diarrhea. The lack of safe drinking water and the generally unsanitary conditions in which they live are key culprits. Singer notes that very reputable and accountable aid organizations such as Oxfam and UNICEF, are working to alleviate these conditions and are highly effective at doing so. They would be even more effective if even more people donated. So, for example, if you and I were to reduce our expenditures by even $20 a month and send that money to Oxfam, we can be sure that our money would rather directly bring about fewer child deaths. Oxfam and other organizations keep transparent records and routinely let themselves be audited by external agencies. Singer raises the following question: is it possible that by choosing to spend your money on such things as eating out, buying expensive clothes, attending movies and concerts, rather than contributing to an aid agency, you are leaving a child to die, a child you could have saved? Now, the answer to this question is clearly yes. If one got into the habit of donating to such relief agencies, a good number of children's lives would be saved over time. Now, let us remember the details of the drowning child scenario. A young toddler is drowning in a pond in the park. You are the only one in a position to save the child. Helping the child will ruin your shoes, get your suit wet, and make you late for work, and you're not responsible for putting the child in danger in the first place. Donating to a world relief agency has similar properties. Young children are dying. You can save some of them with little effort or loss. You are not responsible for putting them in danger in the first place. The only disanalogies are that the foreign children are far away, they are citizens of another country, and other people are also in a position to help. Now, none of these disanalogies are morally significant in this kind of case. The distance between you and the foreign children is clearly morally irrelevant. Sure, one feels more of a pull to jump in and save the child in one's immediate visual field, but just because we do not feel that same strong pull does not mean that the two situations are, morally speaking, dissimilar. Both actions prevent death at little cost to oneself, and that is what makes them morally correct or morally praiseworthy. Hence, if failing to save the drowning child would be wrong, because one would be letting a child die, then the same rationale applies to failing to donate money overseas to save children. Remember that there are many reputable aid agencies who can be trusted. Also, you would still be morally obligated to attempt to save the drowning child, even if you only had a 50% chance of success or less. So even if, realistically, it's not 100% guaranteed that your money would get to where it's supposed to go, even if it's 50% likely to get there, you'd still have the situation would be analogous to a situation in which if you were to jump in and grab the child, that you would only have a 50% chance of saving that child. But this is still significant enough a chance of success that one would still be morally obligated to try and rescue the drowning child. Hence, similar things could be said for donating to aid agencies, even if, of course, we can't 100% absolutely guarantee nothing inadvertent happens or corrupt. But again, these agencies are well monitored, and that's actually highly unlikely. Okay, now, so let's look at the other two disanalogies. These are more significant. Let's consider the first. Maybe we owe more to our fellow citizens than foreign ones. In some types of situations, this is true. If you are a member of the U.S. military, then you have more of an obligation to defend U.S. citizens than foreign ones. But the type of scenario we are discussing doesn't seem to be one in which you have more obligations towards U.S. citizens than foreign ones. For one thing, it wouldn't matter at all, morally speaking, if you knew the child drowning in front of you was a foreign citizen. It would still be wrong not to help. Hence the fact that those dying from extreme poverty are by and large foreign citizens. That shouldn't matter either. What about the fact that others are also in position to help? Singer addresses this in the text at one point. He basically argues that even though many are in a position to help, you know based on past experience and data that not enough people will donate money to maximize the number of lives which could be saved. Uh, so let's just modify the drowning child scenario again to make it similar. Imagine you are with a group of people that are watching a child drown, and you quickly come to understand that they are all waiting for someone else to act. Assuming that you have the clarity of mind to act, don't you still have an obligation to? Once you realize that others are paralyzed, distracted, or indifferent, you will also realize that whether the child lives or dies is going to come down to your decision. Similarly, one realizes that others could donate sufficient money to save the children, but one should also realize that this won't actually happen, and that by failing to donate oneself, fewer lives will be saved. Singer then takes the time to detail just how bad world poverty really is. The World Bank defines extreme poverty as having to get by on $1.25 a day. 1.4 billion people fall under this poverty line. It is important to realize that this figure has already been adjusted to U.S. purchasing power. Hence, a person under the extreme poverty line can afford to purchase the same products you could afford to purchase with $1.25 in the United States. This figure already takes into account that products in foreign countries are often cheaper. This most recent figure, the 1.4 billion one, is an improvement over the 1981 figure. In 1981, 1.9 people lived in extreme poverty, and there were far fewer total persons in the world back then, about 1.5 billion less, I believe. This shows that the decisions we make as individuals, organizations, and countries can provoke effective change, yet we still have a long way to go. Singer also mentions, probably just to correct a stereotype, that it's actually South Asia, which is the world's poorest region, with 455 million extremely poor people living in India alone. So it truly is a global problem. Now, U.S. poverty is nothing to laugh about, but the kind of extreme poverty at the worldwide level that Singer is addressing is actually far worse. When one lives on under $1.25 a day, the following experiences are commonplace. You are constantly short of food and can often only eat one meal a day. You have to choose between feeding yourself or your child. You can't save money due to emergencies and high interest rates, or send your kids to school. You live in an unstable house and lack clean drinking water that must be boiled. The law does not respect you, and often won't protect you. These features of living in poverty have been documented by the World Bank in a study of over 60,000 people. As you can see, when one lives in extreme poverty, Receiving aid can mean the difference between life and death. No unhealthy dependencies are fostered by helping people with next to nothing. It is simply not the case that they could have found a way to help themselves without the aid one has provided. Let us now focus our attention on the other side of the story. Just as over 1 billion people live extremely impoverished lives on our planet, about 1 billion are extravagantly rich by historical standards. Even King Louis XIV, who lived in the most extravagant castle ever built, did not have access to penicillin, Novocaine, quality dental care, rapid transportation, innumerable entertainment options, year-round fruits and vegetables, or air conditioning. The middle class and rich of both America and most modern countries take these extravagances for granted. The super rich fly around in private jets, have multiple mansions, and buy watches that cost over $5,000. Meanwhile, even us ordinary folk spend far more than we need to on gourmet coffee, bottled water, and food in restaurants, which we often do not even bother to finish. Questions 4A and B are personal response questions, so let's jump ahead to 4C. Singer lays out a formal argument that we have a moral obligation to donate some of our money to those who live in dire poverty. The second premise is an expression of consequentialism. Here is the argument. So P actually stands for premise, and that means a reason to think something is true. So premise 1, suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. Premise 2, if it is in your power to prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything nearly as important, it is wrong not to do so. Premise 3, by donating to aid agencies, you can prevent suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care without sacrificing anything nearly as important. This entails the conclusion. Therefore, if you do not donate to aid agencies, you are doing something wrong. There are a couple of features of this argument which are worth commenting upon. First, and as noted above, it is the second premise which expresses a consequentialist principle. Since the bad things Singer focuses on all involve human suffering, you can think of this more specifically as a utilitarian argument as well. The second thing worth mentioning is that Singer's conclusion does not specify the amount of aid one is obligated to donate. Technically, the premises of this argument entail that we need to keep giving until the suffering caused to ourselves by further giving equals the amount of suffering our giving would relieve. Go ahead and reread the second premise, and I think you will see why. The utility of giving, even at a very high cost to oneself, is still very high when that giving results in healing sick children, providing clean water, and other important goods. Singer realizes that pretty much nobody is willing to strive for that level of sacrifice. Hence, he waters down the conclusion and simply points out that some amount of donation is called for. The demanding nature of consequentialism is something its critics have latched onto. It does indeed appear this theory does actually demand too much of us, especially hedonistic utilitarianism, because it entails we must contribute to the common good, even if doing so requires an enormous level of sacrifice. Through the years, Singer has mellowed a bit in his books regarding the level of giving he challenges people to achieve. So even if premise 2 isn't exactly correct, something like premise 2, maybe a weaker version, is still plausible. That if we can prevent something bad happening without really much effort at all in comparison, it is wrong not to do so. Um, so this would be a less demanding premise 2, but it would be more plausible, and it would still get Singer's desired conclusion that we have an obligation to donate something. Okay, now Singer discusses 3 objections to his argument that he has come across. The first is from a high school student named Catherine. She more or less states that what one is morally obligated to do is decided by what one believes one is morally obligated to do, and nothing else. This view of morality has a name. It is called relativism. The problem with ethical relativism is that the rightness and wrongness of an action is not determined by what a person believes. Singer points out that everyone acknowledges this in practice when they encounter truly evil actions, such as rape, murder, or terrorism. We never let people off the hook for heinous actions just because they express their belief that they think the actions are morally acceptable. Singer could have added that the wrongness of an action correlates rather well with that action's tendency to cause harm. Really bad actions are really harmful ones, such as genocide, murder, and torturing the innocent. Actions that are bad, but not as bad, are less bad because they are less harmful. So, for example, lying and stealing are typically more minor forms of bad action. And again, this is because they're less harmful. Furthermore, consider the old adage, the punishment should fit the crime. This adage reflects what has just been said. Hence, it's not belief that determines right and wrong. It's the harm that would be caused by an action, which determines if it's right or wrong. Okay. Now, second objection. Douglas, who is a high school student, also a high school student, proposes this one. Douglas responds to Singer by asserting that Singer does not have the right to tell people what to do, and Douglas has the right to spend his own money any way he wants. In order to see what is wrong with this objection, consider the following 2 uses of the term right. So let's define an action as morally right. What that means is that this action is the one that should be performed because it maximizes good consequences and minimizes bad ones. So this is roughly the utilitarian or consequentialist definition of a right action. And now consider this phrase, or the meaning of this phrase. I have the right to perform an action. All this means is that others are not morally permitted to force me not to do this action. Now, just because Douglas is correct when he states that Singer has no right to order other people to do things, this is that second notion of rightness on the screen, it does not follow that Singer's arguments about what one is morally required to do are not strong arguments. Just to give kind of an analogous example, I have the right to hit my head against the wall in my own house, but it doesn't follow that this is the action I ought to perform. Similarly, even though one can't force another private citizen to send their money overseas, the action of sending the money may still be what morality requires. Now, sometimes these coincide. So, if an action is morally wrong, for example, like really wrong, like murder or something like that, then nobody has the right to perform that action. But for a range of actions, such as giving, uh, even though some level of giving, at least, is the right thing to do, morally speaking, we tend to still give people the decision whether or not they actually want to do it. Okay. Finally, Jan Narveson is a libertarian philosopher, and Narveson argues in response to Singer's suggestion that we have an obligation to help those in dire poverty, or we only have an obligation to help those in dire poverty if we're the ones who have harmed these people. So if we haven't done the harm, then we are not responsible for helping. Helping would be a nice and good thing to do, but one does not have a moral obligation or duty to do so, says Narveson. Now, one response to Narveson that Singer didn't make here but could have is that Narveson's claim entails the wrong result in the drowning child scenario. One is morally criticizable as cruel, selfish, and inhumane for failing to pull the drowning kid out of the water, even though one didn't put the child in the water. Hence, there are clear counterexamples to Narveson's claim that we never have a duty to help others if we didn't put them in danger in the first place. A good indication that someone has violated a moral duty is that it is appropriate to at least criticize that person, even if it is not appropriate to mete out any kind of punishment. If one were to let the child drown, a whole host of negative appraisals of one's character and negative reactions on the part of others would be morally justified. The public would be justified in shaming one for such behavior, and one's significant other would be justified in being disgusted with and even distancing themselves from the offender. Now, what Singer does say is also enlightening. Singer points out that rich countries have harmed and continue to harm poor countries on a regular basis. Exxon imports oil from corrupt and obscenely rich dictators who leave their own citizens in dire poverty. Buying oil from such countries is a lot like trafficking in stolen goods. For example, the leader of Equatorial Guinea is a dictator, such a dictator that Exxon buys from. The citizens of his country would be more than justified in overthrowing him as leader, since he hoards wealth in a manner that causes great suffering. Now, buying oil from Guinea perpetuates that corrupt social order and contributes to keeping Guinea's citizens in poverty. And again, the oil is a stolen good, and our companies buy it, and we, of course, benefit from that at the pump. Singer multiplies such examples when he talks about the fishermen in Senegal, whose fish were taken by modern European fishermen who overfished. He also notes that rich countries, not poor ones, have produced the vast majority of emissions that cause global warming. Yet, the citizens of poor countries are the ones who suffer from global warming the most. So That's Singer's response to Narveson. So he basically says, even if you're right, even if a group or an individual only has an obligation to help if they cause the harm themselves, Singer just notes that we've caused plenty of harm. All right, so I'm going to end here. At this point, you should proceed to the discussion board.